Welcome again, patrons. So this is another set of questions and answers. You can see behind me at the moment it's on loan to us for the period of Tankfest. This is this lovely IS-3 that's come over from the Brussels military collection, and that's the backdrop for today. But on with the questions. So Robert Theth says, out of all known tanks, what was the one that seemed to have the most mechanical issues in the field that wasn't battle related? In other words, engines overheating a lot. Well, we're the British Tank Museum, and talking from the British perspective, the tank that often gets talked about as having a terrible service history is the British Covenanter. It was sometimes referred to as a Cruiser Mark V, and it was a replacement for the A13 cruiser tank. Now, the issue about the Covenanter, they were trying to keep its profile low, and they ended up getting a Meadows flat 12-cylinder engine. Now, as they put that in the engine bay, it meant there wasn't enough room for the cooling system and the cooling fans. So they ended up doing a system of taking the water to cool the engine all the way round to the front of the vehicle and put some coolant pipes underneath some armoured shrouds at the front. Now that caused no end of trouble, such as fracturing in the leak pipes, etc., in the pipes that were taking the water around. So lots of things went wrong with the Covenanter. And in Britain, in the Second World War, they made over 1,700 Covenanter tanks. Not one of them, as a gun tank, went abroad to see active service. They realised straight away there was no point taking it to places like the North African campaign because of this overheating issues it had. Its mechanical reliability was appalling. Lots of things went wrong with the Covenanter. Now, subsequently, it was replaced by the Crusader tank. That does go out and see action. They're similar looking tanks. They've got lots of faceted surfaces, angled. The idea of the angling was to try and increase the level of the armour protection and keep the weight down. Unfortunately, the Covenanter, one of the other problems it had is this Meadows engine. As they designed it, it was going to have things like aluminium road wheels. There wasn't enough aluminium available. That was going off to the aircraft industry. They ended up putting steel road wheels there. They upped the armour specification to 40 millimetres on the front. So that ended up increasing the weight. It was at full capacity as it was driving around in terms of the engine load and the suspension. So there was no real room for improvement on that particular vehicle. So the Covenanter, from the British perspective, is the tank. You know, 1,700, that's a lot of engineering effort. They were used in the UK mainly for training. They equipped a number of armoured divisions, but as soon as those armoured divisions were going to go off to fight, they'd either have their tanks replaced by Cromwells or Shermans or whatever else was available, because we couldn't risk sending British soldiers off to fight in such an unreliable tank. And once I took a veteran around the Tank Museum, we got to the Covenanter, he looked at the ball in front of it, realised what the tank was, and he kind of went on the ground. No one has a nice word to say for the British Covenanter tank. So, on with the next question. Steamworks asks, of all the tanks at the museum that needed to be or has been restored, what was the most difficult? What had the most problems when it arrived? Well, funny enough, the Covenanter probably kind of fits into that category as well, because that was actually dug out the ground. It was part of 13th, 18th Royal Hussars. At the end of their training over in Kent, for whatever reason, a number of tanks ended up being bulldozed into a bank in the ground in an area that's now a farm. That vehicle, when it came out, was in pretty rotten order. We've ended up restoring that cosmetically, so it looks reasonably good. So there's an example of a tank that, when it came here, was in pretty rough order. Other tanks, such as the complexity of things like our Tiger I, it's there, but it's how do you actually get these complex systems working again? So we've got a number of vehicles where the man hours, it may not look very different from some sort of wreck turning up to being put back into running order. What does tend to happen though is sometimes the systems, getting those systems working again, whether it's taking an engine out, getting all that put together. Now obviously for us, we spend a lot of time and energy on our Tiger, but probably in terms of man hours, more time and energy goes on regular running vehicles like our Chieftain over time, because it needs servicing every year to keep it going. So again, that's almost like maintenance as opposed to restoration or conservation of a vehicle. And one of the issues that, again, you can see we're in our lovely new workshop, we're going to be able to spend more time now on doing conservation. In other words, keeping what's original up to spec, doing it properly that way, and also going to be able to spend more time on restoration projects. And some of the vehicles in the museum, to put it bluntly, they've had a lick of paint, but apart from that, they've had no attention at all for decades. So this new facility is going to give us those the opportunity to be able to do things like that. So that doesn't really answer the question. I don't know is really the honest question there. Some of the workshop guys who've worked on a vehicle for an awful long time will be able to tell you things like man hours, complexities. Modern tanks, look at the complexities of a modern car, replicate that in a tank. Those are things that are very problematic to keep going, that we're trying to do as tanks get more complex if we want to run it. In terms of restoration, off the top of my head, I'd probably say our Tiger One has had more time, money and attention spent on it than any other single tank in the museum collection at the moment. Richard James, any information on why the London Midland and Scottish Railway Company built the Covenant, a cruiser tank, just after, over just making other war materials? Now in the 1930s, this takes us back to that period where what happens is the British government, when it looks like there could be another war, from the mid-30s, 1936, they start looking at getting companies in the UK to potentially build war material. And what they do is they do things called a shadow factory scheme. So for the Air Force, which kind of leads the way in this, they're looking at if the one or two major manufacturers of aeroplanes are likely to be targeted and bombed, and that was a great fear in the 30s, a bomber would always get through, we're going to have to distribute capacity around the country and also increase that capacity. Now that happens as well with the idea of tank manufacture. We haven't got a big tank industry. In essence, there's Woolwich Arsenal, Vickers are the only two major tank builders. They start in the mid-30s looking at other companies that can do it, funding other factories to be built in time of war, so that again, ready for time of war, so that we can increase the manufacture. London, Midland and Scottish Railways, they look at people who have got heavy industry, are used to using heavy machinery. They think the railway carriage companies and locomotive manufacturers are going to be the ones that will be good for tanks. Interestingly, over in America, similar ideas, but the head of General Motors, who's on the board for giving advice from industry to the American government, in 1941, he ends up recommending to Roosevelt, go to the car industry instead. Don't worry about just heavy machinery manufacturers, because of the numbers that are going to be required in terms of pumping out tanks in America. They decide to go for car manufacturers who are much more used to the idea of mass production. Now in Britain, so London, Midland, Scottish, they end up building the Covenanter. They actually stop, there's two main factories they're building Covenanter tanks in. They stop in August of 1942. They're taken off the Covenanter program because by this time, American manufacture is starting to step up, and they are actually put back onto building locomotives, because that's considered. It was thought that we're going to need about 600 new locomotives a year in Britain for domestic use and military use. Actually, we're only building about 3,000. So they decided that capacity for London, Midland, Scottish is better making locomotives than the tanks. And at that point as well, we've already discussed the fact the Covenanter wasn't a great tank. One of the other London, Midland, Scottish factories went on to it was making Centaurs, but again, that one was stopped and they go back to locomotives because, again, we're now getting the American largesse. We've got Lend-Lease, so Shermans are appearing in large enough numbers, and the Covenanter production is stopped anyway. So it's one of those companies that, again, before the war, were looking how we might expand. London, Midland, Scottish, one of a number of countries they're looking at in the 30s, and when war comes, we turn them over towards, in this particular case, tank production rather than other war material. Right, Sonny Butterworth mentions the fact, he says, he's read a book, A.J. Smithers, A New Excalibur, and in that book, when they're discussing early precursors to the tank, he mentions that Lancelot de Mole's first design for a multi-wheel platform with a steering system of considerable ingenuity, a model of it picked up in a Brighton junk shop, is in the Tank Museum. That's a quote from the book. Now, that model is actually this model here. And we'll do a cutaway of it in a moment so you can see a little bit closer. This is a model designed. It's actually got the maker of the model on the front. It says, modelled by James P. McGuinness, 11 Carteret Street, London, SW. The idea, we haven't really got much in the way of paperwork with it, but the story is this is a Lancelot de Mole design. If you haven't heard of Lancelot de Mole, he's an Australian who's coming up with lots of ideas as an inventor. In 1912, he sends off some designs for what really looks like a World War I tank, slightly wedge-shaped vehicle with tracks around it, to the British War Office, who politely decline it. After the war, there is much discussion about who gets credit for the tank. De Mole puts in a case saying, listen, I did something like the tank just before the war, do I get any recognition for this? And as often with people who are precursors, they're running before, they've got ideas ahead of the game, one of the issues we all like with retrospect turning around saying, oh, well, you know, why didn't they listen to them? He'd got great ideas, why didn't we do all this? The issue is there was no call for a tank in 1912. This idea that we're all going to magically know the future and know that we're going to need a big, heavy breakthrough weapon later on in a major European war, that's just not. We're seeing the future, and we've got that benefit of hindsight. So in many ways, just like the British Army in 1907 were trialling a tracked petrol-driven or paraffin-driven Hornsby tractor to pull guns around, everyone's saying, well, why didn't they go down that route? If you read the reasoning behind it, very logical. It's a technology in its infancy. We don't think we're going to be able to cover all our issues by going down the route of a tracked towing vehicle or a tractor of some sort. Therefore, we don't think now's the time to start putting it into service. And they were really worried about those vehicles frightening horses, which was still going to be the mass transportation method. So again, sometimes if you read the logic of the answers, just because we now know, oh, it might have gone that way, if militaries and governments buy every last proposal that's sent to them, just in case, they'd have no money to actually run a proper army. So de Mole got a great idea, brilliantly ahead of his time in many ways. Actually, in 1912, it wasn't a needed weapon. So his actual suggestions were rejected. Right, on to the next question. Here we go, Josh Salazar. He had an uncle who served in Vietnam, and he found a picture of the tank that he was on, which he said the American Marines called it the Zippo. Does this nickname ring a bell? And it looked like an M47 pattern. Actually, what you're looking at there is a tank that they did nickname the Zippo. It was actually an M48. Between 1952 and 54, about 109 of these tanks were converted into being flamethrowers. And it was the last flame-throwing tank the Americans had in service. The flame gun actually went out the main barrel, so it wouldn't actually fire conventional ammunition out of the main gun. They were taken to Vietnam, nicknamed a Zippo, obviously after a Zippo lighter. They were used out there. They were carried on into the early 1970s. When they were done away with, the American infantry now doesn't have flamethrowers. Flamethrowers, controversial weapon. You go back to the Second World War. Sometimes British Crocodile tanks would turn up, flame a position or flame a building, and that alone was enough to get the German soldiers who were fighting against them to surrender. We all have a massive fear of flame, in other words, of being burnt. So these flame weapons, they were used in Vietnam, they were used sometimes to flush out bunkers, sometimes just to take vegetation back to exposed positions. The American military hasn't got a flamethrower now in service. It's another one of those weapon systems that may come back again depending on the nature of future conflicts. So again, it's another one of those sort of areas, but the bit of controversy around it as well from the point of view of is it a fear weapon, is it a chemical weapon, how do we really look at the flame? But certainly in the Second World War and just immediately post the Second World War, flamethrowers were most countries' weapon inventories. So that brings me to the end of these particular set of questions. As ever, keep them coming. Thank you so much as patrons for supporting us. We've got other news. We're going to be pushing our patron scheme, just if you're watching this, with ideas about how we want to get more people. Encourage other people, please do, because when we're making our online content, putting it out there, we're a charity. It does cost us time, money, and energy. We've got to somehow justify doing this. And one way that, if you do appreciate what we're doing, is by joining the patron scheme, encouraging others to do such a thing. That helps us fund what we're doing and means we can continue doing it. So thank you for being a patron in the first place. Try and get someone else to be a patron as well. That would do us a great favour.